Hello and welcome back to Downtime Activities. Matt here with another help action for you guys. This one all about those creatures of the night vampires. Specifically vampires as players, or players as vampires I should say. There's lots of different options about how to make a player become a vampire, and they have widely different power scales. I'm sure there's lots of DMs out there who've had those kind of hard conversations with their players about how best to do this. So we're going to go over lots of options, both official and not, and I'm going to kind of break down my opinion and how best to approach this problem in play.
There are really two main ways for a character to play a vampire, at least officially, in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. One is using a vampire race, and the other is using the actual true vampire rules from the monster manual. These two have very different power levels, one of which being massively more powerful than the other, and have very different rules in how they work. I'm going to break both of them down here, as well as a kind of middle ground option that I've come up with that will give you a lot of that power spike, but tone down a little bit from the full-on vampire option. We're going to start by breaking down the race option of being a vampire. There are 3 different vampire races, one of which I think is a little better overall than the other 2, but I'm going to go over all 3 here. I'm going to start by breaking down the Dhampir race. This is a really good option, I think, overall for a character to become a vampire and have a lot of abilities that make sense for being a vampire without massively making them more powerful than other players at the table. Using this to become a vampire will allow you to basically replace your race with it, while still maintaining some of your normal racial bonuses. Basically, when you take this, you get this Ancestral Legacy option, which allows you to keep skill proficiencies in climbing, flying, or swimming speeds that you got from your other race, but if you didn't get those from your other race, or choose not to keep them, you can instead get proficiency in 2 skills of your choice. You'll also get a 35-foot walking speed, dark vision of 60 feet, their Deathless Nature ability, which means you no longer need to breathe, Spider Climbing, which starts as just a climbing speed until you get to 3rd level, after which it's true spider climbing, you know, the whole walking up walls and along roofs with your hands free sort of thing. You'll also get their Vampiric Bite, which is a really cool, flavorful way to show the vampire teeth on your character. It is a natural weapon that you are considered proficient in, and that you use your con modifier for attack and damage rolls with. If you're missing half or more of your hit points, you have advantage on attacks with this. When it hits, if the creature it hits isn't a construct or an undead, you can also empower it, which allows you to either regain hit points equal to the piercing damage you deal, or get a bonus to your next ability, check, or attack roll equal to that same piercing damage. This empower ability can be used a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest. The other 2 race options come from plane shifts from Magic the Gathering planes, and they are both the Ixalan and Zendikar vampires. These 2 are really similar, but they differ a little bit in how their bite attack works. Technically, for both of these, they're a race that you should start with from the beginning, but you could definitely, kind of similarly to the Dhampir race, add these later in play as makes sense to your character. For the Ixalan vampire, I would have it give the 60 feet dark vision and the resistance to necrotic damage, as well as their Bloodthirst ability. This is their bite attack. The way this bite attack works is you can take a willing grappled, incapacitated, or restrained creature and do a melee attack against them. If it hits, it'll deal 1 piercing damage and 1d6 necrotic damage. Their maximum hit points are reduced by that amount of necrotic damage, and you regain that many hit points. The reduction lasts until their next short rest, and the creature will die if their max hit points are reduced to 0 by that necrotic damage. The Ixalan vampire also gets the Feast of Blood ability, which means that after they drain the blood from a creature, their speed will increase by 10 feet, and they'll get advantage on strength and dex checks and saving throws for the next minute. The Zendikar vampire is much the same, except their Bloodthirst ability is going to operate a little bit differently, and they aren't going to get that Feast of Blood ability. The Bloodthirst ability overall is going to be the exact same as far as a willing, grappled, incapacitated, or restrained creature, a melee attack against them, 1 piercing, 1d6 necrotic, and the maximum hit point reduction as well as the regaining of hit points. Similarly, that reduction will last until a short rest, but if that creature dies as a result of their max hit points dropping to 0, they will rise as a null under the Zendikar vampire's control. For a null, you just use zombie stats. So it takes away that kind of Feast of Blood buff ability from draining people, and instead gives them a cool way to make undead thralls. Overall, I feel like the Dhampir is the better option here because it gives multiple different abilities that help your character feel like a vampire, but if a player really liked those Bloodthirst abilities and thought they made more sense for their character or were cooler, I'd totally let them use them instead. Next, I'm going to go over the rules for becoming an actual true vampire, as described in the Monster Manual Vampire Stat Block. This is a multi-step process, and the very beginning of this I feel like is probably often overlooked by many playgroups. That first step is becoming a vampire spawn. For your character to become a true vampire, they must first become a vampire spawn, and this requires them to be slain by the vampire's bite and then buried. After this, they rise as a vampire spawn, which will be under that vampire's control, and then the vampire can choose to give them the gift of true vampirism. If this does happen, the player will get a lot of very powerful abilities and increases that make their character leaps and bounds stronger than another average character at their same level. First off, their strength, dexterity, and constitution will all become 18, unless that character already had a higher score in one of those. They also gain some damage resistances to both necrotic, as well as bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapons. They'll get 120 feet of dark vision and a number of really powerful abilities. They'll get the shape changer ability from the vampire, which allows them to shift into either a bat or into mist. And also, with the rules as written, they do get the legendary resistances of vampires, meaning a 3-a-day free reroll on a failed saving throw. They also get the Misti Escape, which is a powerful survival mechanic whenever they drop to 0 hit points. They get regeneration, which is a 20 hit point per round regeneration, so long as it's not stopped by sunlight, running water, or an attack from holy water or radiant damage. They'll get the spider climbing ability, all the vampiric weaknesses, which include things like taking damage in sunlight or running water, as well as needing permission to enter into people's homes, things along those lines. They'll get multi-attack, and they will also get the claw and bite attacks of vampires. They'll get a Vampire Charm ability, which is a pretty potent ability, as well as a summoning ability called Children of the Night, which allows them to summon bats, rats, or wolves once a day. This is a massive power spike. All these abilities are really strong, and the weaknesses that come along with them certainly do not outweigh the strength of the new abilities the player has. As a third option here, instead of using a true full vampire or just a vampire race, I've come up with a way that kind of bridges the gap in power level, and that is allowing a character to basically become a vampire spawn. This will work a lot like the turning into a full-fledged vampire, just narrow down some of those abilities to make them a little less strong and take away some of the more overpowered ones of them. Much like the regular vampire, I am going to give a buff to those physical stats, but I'm going to make it in line with the vampire spawn instead of the vampire. This means that strength, dexterity, and con will all become 16 unless the character already had a higher score on this. This is still powerful, but less so. They'll get the same damage resistances to both necrotic and bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons, and a couple of those same abilities, though most of them are going to be toned down. They will get the regeneration ability, but it'll be 10 hit points per round instead of 20, and similarly, it's only going to function if they have at least 1 hit point left, and it can be stopped by sunlight, running water, or attacks from holy water or radiant damage. They'll also get full spider climbing, those same slew of vampiric weaknesses, and multi-attack. They will get the claw and bite attacks, but they will do less damage to match the damage of a vampire spawn instead of a vampire. This is still a really big power spike and does give a lot of cool, powerful options, but is certainly scaled back quite a bit from a full-fledged vampire. To close this video out, I want to kind of go over each of these 3 options and discuss my opinion on how and when best to use them, and what sort of gameplay decision you're making when you allow a player to use one of these options. Starting with the race, I think this is overall, across the board, the best option to use. It'll give flavorful abilities that'll make a character feel like a vampire without massively tipping the scale. This means that your character will get to have those cool story moments and have those things that make them feel like a vampire without irritating other players at the table as they have this massive power spike that puts them leaps and bounds above the other players. I suggest the Dhampir race here as your go-to option, but if you have a character who really prefers one of the other two, they're totally fine as well. all three will do the job of making the character have some abilities that makes them feel like a vampire without a big shift in power. Using that unofficial option I presented here, making your character a vampire spawn, is an okay option as well. It'll still give a pretty large spike in power, but tone down quite a bit from the true vampire stats. I would suggest using this only in middle to high levels of play, and make sure that it's with a group of players who's pretty comfortable playing together and wouldn't be offended if one player gets a pretty big power spike over everyone else at the table. Also, when using this option, or really any of these options, RP needs to stay kind of a central focus in how that character plays from that point on. You need to have things like the vampire's need to feed come up pretty regularly as another balancing factor, as well as just something interesting and fun to add to the story of your game. Lastly, when using true vampire stats, I would shy away from this more often than not, and really only use it at pretty high levels of play where that power spike will be a little less apparent. Also, make sure everyone at the table is okay with it, and that you're not going to hurt people's feelings when they watch one player get this huge power spike that their character doesn't get to have. I'd also say that this option is best for shorter games or one-shots instead of full-fledged campaigns, as that big power spike will be a little less impactful in shorter sessions of play. If you're all playing 20th level characters in a one-shot that's just supposed to be powerful and fun, who cares if one of the characters is a vampire? Similarly to all the other options, RP needs to be front and center here, and it should be something that's very important and relevant in gameplay. That need to feed from the vampire should be there, and the decision to trust a vampire in order for the character to become one should be a really risky and impactful one. Remember that part of this is trusting the vampire to kill your character, allow you to rise as a spawn under its control, and then the vampire has to be trusted at that point to give this gift to the player. That's a lot of trust to place in a lawful evil bloodsucker, if you ask me, and the risk of that should be really apparent to the character whenever they're deciding to make that decision. Lastly, as a note to players here, I suggest being really honest with yourself in why you want your character to be a vampire. There's a lot of good reasons to be a vampire in a story. It can add really fun and cool elements and make a character really, really interesting. The flavor of that is awesome, especially in gothic horror themed games, but if your whole goal as a player with getting this new suite of abilities is to just be more powerful or to power game, then you're missing the point altogether. Flavor should be front and center, and honestly, for most characters and in most situations, just using that Dampier race option will do enough of that to make the character have enough abilities to feel interesting and cool and add to the story without any big shifts in the power scale. All these options are valid, just make sure that you use the one that matches your power level and the style of play that you're looking for in your game. And of course, make sure that as a player, you're having a conversation with your DM about this and your goals for your character. Make sure that they understand what you're wanting, how you're wanting to go about it, and how you're wanting to add this vampiric race to your character and to their world. And make sure as a DM that that conversation is including the other players at the table. Everyone needs to be aware of this and needs to make sure that they're comfortable and they're going to be alright with this happening in a game to avoid hurt feelings as one character gets a big power spike. Having a vampire as a character is awesome and makes for a really fun game. Just make sure you do it right.
That has been our help action on how to have your players become vampires in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Hope you found this useful, hope this has helped kind of give you multiple different options for different ways to go about this pretty tricky thing to do in 5th edition. If you like this kind of content, we've got tons of help actions out there, breaking down all sorts of different stuff, crafting and the like, things that have hard to really quantify rules sometimes, and our advice on how best to use them. Please feel free to check all those out. Also, if you like this video, please give it a like or a comment. It means a lot to us and it helps the channel out a lot. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.